So welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, and I will serve as the host for today's session. Thrilled to have a full room, as well as having friends and colleagues and alumni joining us via Zoom live streaming here today. It's a distinct pleasure and honor to be able to host in conversation today our old friend Al McGartland. Al is now the Economic Policy Director at the NYU School of Law at the Institute for Policy Integrity there at NYU. Now, usually I go through a couple of bullet points about the bio of our speakers here in the seminar series. What I thought I would do is read for you what the committee that helped select Al as a fellow of the Association of Environmental Resource Economists wrote about him and his long career having advanced economics on environmental issues at the Environmental Protection Agency. Al McGartland has devoted his career to advancing the use of economic analysis in environmental policy. He forsook an academic career to pursue public service in the federal government over 30 years ago. Admittedly, now it was over 40 years ago. This was written in 2017 when he was named a fellow. In the early days of his career at EPA, economic analysis in general and benefit cost analysis in particular were often crudely conducted and rarely considered in the decision-making process. With the passage of EO 12866, Al saw an opportunity to enhance the use of economic analysis in environmental decision-making and set out on a path to single-handedly create a high-quality economic shop within the agency. Now called the National Center for Environmental Economics, Al's keen awareness of the role of economic analysis could have in decision-making, and importantly, how to deliver it in a way that is relevant for decision makers, advanced economics from an oft-overlooked analysis to a key part of the decision-making process. Key highlights from his career include the development of EPA's guidelines for preparing economic analyses, which a number of Harvard faculty over the years have helped contribute. I think Rob Stevens may have chaired the first committee that reviewed the guidelines.
Yes, indeed.
These guidelines provide consistency and rigor to EPA's economic analysis in ways unsurpassed by other federal agencies. And they are also frequently used as a teaching tool in university classrooms. Al was also instrumental in the formation of EPA's Science Advisory Board's Environmental Economics Advisory Committee, a standing committee of notable academics and researchers who routinely advise the agency on economic matters ranging from economy-wide modeling to valuing mortality risk reductions to measuring the cost of pollution abatement and provide necessary peer review in the scientific process. The impact of Al's contributions to the field of environmental economics and environmental policy cannot be underestimated. So Al, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar. It's great to have you here. And I want to say for all of us here today, especially for a lot of the students, I wanted to bring in someone who has spent his entire career until just a few weeks ago, working in civil service, advancing the role of evidence and insight to inform energy and environmental policy. So Al, welcome. And first, I want to go back in time. And just to let everyone know, I will let you ask questions too, but Al and I thought it would be fun to start things off with a little bit of a fireside chat. So you joined EPA as an economist right after finishing your PhD in 1984. Set the scene for us about sort of the role of economic analysis then, and especially benefit cost analysis, and how that played into the way decisions were made at EPA, which especially at that time, but generally over the 50 plus years of the EPA, has been a primarily regulatory agency.
Thanks, Joe. And it's just a real pleasure and honor to be here. I'm sort of tickled to death. So and Joe is right that Harvard has supplied many people, and particularly from the Kennedy School faculty, to come and spend and donate really their time to EPA, either through the Science Advisory Boards or Times in Government, which Joe and Jim has done, and then go on to be real allies for NC in particular, but EPA in the White House and other places. So it's just a thrill. But going back in time, so I must have had my head examined. I was married at the time, and my wife had a great job at the Fed. I met her in grad school. She's slightly ahead of me, so she was at the Federal Reserve, and we made a deal that if I got a really good offer, we could leave DC, and she would leave her job. But if it would take something great, and the only offer I got was at Syracuse, I think, and it was to teach urban economics. They didn't even really teach environmental economics. So keep in mind, back then, environment was rarely a field in major universities. So it was the exception, not the rule. Thank God that's changed as well. So I took the EPA job thinking I'm going to leave in a few years and go into academics, right? That I'll gain a lot of knowledge. And that was sort of the short run plan. And when I got to EPA, there was a few economists scattered through the agency, with the pesticide office having the most, because when EPA was formed, a lot of the, not a lot, but some of the economists from USDA were parceled off and given to EPA. And FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, and Fungicide Act, actually required benefit. They called it risk-benefit analysis, but they required a kind of economic analysis to help make decisions, which maybe we can get to in a time, because that had its own flaws, despite economists being involved. But anyway, so EPA, because President Reagan's penned Executive Order 12866, which required benefit.
Well, he penned 12291.
12291, sorry, yeah. Fenton was 12866 and still cares. So it's 12291, and that created an instant demand for benefit analysis. And EPA, frankly, was slow on the uptake. But then when they realized that OMB was quite serious about this, they actually started a group of economists, and it was called the benefits branch. Their sole mission was to come up with ways to quantify benefits, not costs, not discounting, not just benefits was all. And that's where they offered me a job. So fortunately, Dick Morgenstern, who had a PhD in economics, was my boss. And then we both reported to a political appointee named Milt Russell, and he had come over from Resources for the Future. And so I reported basically to all PhD economists until I got to the administrator. And boy, was I naive, because I thought that would be like the rest of my career. I would just be answering to economists. But that was definitely the exception, not the rule. But anyway, I think the point is that we were in our infancy period of trying to figure out what benefit cost analysis was, et cetera. And I think the profession, the science of economics, was too. So, I make an example sometimes at USDA. Economists at USDA were quite powerful or quite influential, because think about commodities, right? Corn, soybeans, they were all traded in the marketplace. We had pretty good ideas about what the elasticities of demand and supply were for those things. There was a lot of data and tools and models that we had that could inform policy. We had nothing like that at EPA. So we didn't even know really how to define the commodities, right? What is clean air? What is, safe drinking water, et cetera. So we were like fumbling, to be sure. And so we were starting to piece it together. And then we had a couple of big breakthroughs, I think. And some of it wasn't even on the benefit side of things, as our mission stated. It was really just being good economists in a vacuum of a regulatory world without economists in it. And so we were able to make better contributions on a wide range of things. So I, for example, got my mark. I worked on something called ALAR, and they stuck it on me because I'm the new guy and they wanted to like punish me. So ALAR was a growth regulator used on apples. And it turned out that when you made apple juice, you heated it, and ALAR became unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, or UDMH, which was a carcinogen. And so we were finding this stuff in pretty high doses in apple juice, which was basically used in every daycare center in the entire country, right? And so I was able to team up with a dose, a risk assessor, and we just did a simple cost per cancer case avoided if we got rid of this stuff. And it was dirt cheap. So if you're in the market of buying risk reductions, this was your move. And again, Milt Russell, my boss who came over from RFF, recognized this right away, and we briefed the administrator, and the entire pesticide office, from career all the way to political, was against it. They thought this was like a crazy idea. We would never take such drastic action as getting rid of a chemical that industry absolutely needed, et cetera. And then the next thing I know, and I still think to this day, people think I leaked it, but I didn't. 60 Minutes did a big essay on it and talked about all the stuff that was in apple juice. And Meryl Streep testified in front of Congress on it, and she actually was in tears. So,
but you were not staffing Meryl Streep.
But and then Uniroyal, which is a lesson, they actually voluntarily would, they didn't even wait for EPA to act. They voluntarily withdrew it from the market. They stopped making it because it was such a controversial thing. So it's sort of a power, I think, of marketplace in some ways. But I think the point is, in the absence of thinking, the way economists do in a regulatory agency, it was staffed by scientists and mainly MBAs. I think
Mhm.
in the early days. They were really making sure that we got the regs out on time and that we had the right staffing on what projects, et cetera, but not really an agency of thought, right? Of sort of thinking about things on the margin and maximizing net benefits or even social welfare in some broad sense.
So let's unpack a couple of the things there. So one is the economists are kind of the new kids in the 1980s coming in there at EPA. There was interest at the administrator level to try to say benefit cost analysis is not just a tool for deregulation. How can we be thoughtful in using this to advance our environmental policy? So the phase out of lead in gasoline is a prime example of that. That was kind of almost a response, as I understand the history,
Yep.
of a challenge from the administrator to say, show how economics can justify this. Uh, Share with us a little bit about that experience, but more generally, like where you started to see where economics could, wasn't just thought of as being the tool of deregulation or the tool of those opposed to the agenda of EPA, but could be a mechanism to advance the agency's goals.
That's a great question. Thanks. So every administration has a working model at EPA, right? There's an administrator and deputy administrator, number one and number two, and they kind of decide how they're going to divide the tasks, right? And this was Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the, you know, national treasure, right, from Watergate fame, et cetera. He came back to save EPA from the Ann Gorsuch and horrible era. So, but he was sort of the point person in that broad sense. But Al Alm was the deputy
Mhm.
administrator, and so we were on a track to. I mean, the catalytic converter came up, and that required unleaded gas because leaded gas would clog the catalyters and make them useless. Um, but it turned out lead is a really cheap way to bump up the octane of gasoline, really cheap. And so you could get higher octane gas at a lower price than unleaded which was less quality. So a lot of people were cheating on it. And so Al Alm asked a bunch of us, a handful of us, to think about this and could we come, knowing that it would take a powerful analysis to convince OMB to go along with us, right? This was the Reagan administration. You could sum up the Reagan administration as, less regulation, lower taxes, and more defense. And so this was like hitting right at a core tenet of the administration. So a guy named Joel Schwartz, who's actually at this Harvard School of Public Health now, won a MacArthur Award for the work he did showing that lead, and in particular lead in gas, was responsible for higher blood pressure and then linking that to cardiovascular mortality. So the benefits to kids, which we all understand and know, they were not nearly enough to get us over the hump of, in terms of cost. But once we talk about mortality, anyone that takes an environmental economics course knows that tends to get really large benefits because of Joe's work and others on the value of statistical life, et cetera. So that got us like way over the top. And that actually did convince OMB there was something to this and we were allowed to go forward. And that was, I think, the first time that a benefit cost analysis changed the regulatory agenda, the direction of regulation, and actually benefited the environment. And it certainly taught me a lesson that at that moment, I thought, boy, if we just did a better job more completely and with more quality, more accuracy, quantifying benefits,
Mhm.
I do think there is mostly a strong case, but it would to sort of make progress on the environment, not decrease. I think Joe referenced the reason it is always attached to it was a force for evil, right? For deregulation was because the executive order that we just mentioned that Ronald Reagan uh, signed required two things. It required benefit cost analysis for all major rules. That's, I think, a good thing. But it also required OMB review of all those rules. And so the people tend to link both of them together. And OMB, OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, was sort of the force for regulatory stopping. And then I think benefit cost analysis got sort of tarred by the same brush, and never should have been, in my opinion.
And when we look at the lead experience, it's also interesting that it's one of the first times we do have a little bit of notions of trading, of more flexibility and implementation coming through in the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments. But we had this tradable credit program for refineries, and it started to sort of open up this sort of new set of options where we could be more creative in implementation to try to lower the cost for achieving a given environmental goal. How did that help start to sort of shape some of the discussions over the, say, the latter half of the 80s about how market-based approaches could be employed to address environmental problems?
That's a great question. So you're right. We were worried about sticking the oil industry with this large, bill, right? To suddenly go not cold turkey, it was like a phase out of lead, a really rapid phase out. And in my career, at least 4 people have taken credit for this idea, for coming up with the idea of this trading credits, right? So in theory, the oil companies would get the reduced lead sooner, but not go 100% down, but get credit for it that they could apply on the back end. So not only would you get the health benefits sooner, because these were like undiscounted, but we would also then save costs because the marginal cost curve of getting lead out was highly nonlinear. So that worked out well. And it took someone like Al, who had was he a Kennedy Scholar? He had public policy degrees. I'll have to research that now. He did to teach, yeah. I knew he had some affiliation with Kennedy, but he instantly got it, so that was cool. So I think the true story, by the way, of who actually thought about it was a research assistant at a consulting firm that ran the oil refinery models for us. The firm was called Sabatka and Company, but they had a big oil refinery model. But anyway, that really, despite some of the subsequent cheating that went on, but that really did open up the eyes of how this made it more acceptable to the oil companies, that made it more acceptable to OMB, and it also lowered the costs fairly dramatically. So it did open up everyone's eyes to maybe there is something to, flexibility where the environment doesn't pay a price. So that was
so. And then we saw with the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments the implementation of Title IV to regulate acid rain at power plants that developed trading. Those rules are implemented by the Office of Air and Radiation. You're running an economics office that's in another part of the agency. So help us understand a little bit about how the process works within the agency, on how you and your team of economists help the program offices and how they design and evaluate the regulatory proposals.
Thanks. It's also good. So again, the agency has evolved a bit in this, but every agency has a policy office. It makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, because there's always going to be issues that come up, and you're going to need a team of economists and other kinds of analysts to look at problems as they come up. And but in this case, even climate change and strat ozone, for example, both had its start in the policy office. So the first reports that came out of EPA on sea level rise were policy office products. The air office had no climate expertise or anything else. As the issue got more attention, more funding came, and it just made sense then to migrate most of those people. But even leading up to Kyoto, the negotiations in the Clinton days, I was the office director for what was considered the climate office. I had a group of economists. The aforementioned benefits branch was now morphed into just these economists, but 4 divisions of climate change people. And then when Kyoto was wrapped up, Carol Browner, the then administrator, made a decision that it's time for implementation of climate change, not for economic analysis of climate change. And she moved everyone over to the air office where she thought it belonged. And even at that time, I had a decision to make: did I want to go over to the air office or stay? And that's actually how I created NCEE. I decided we were going to make a run of this as just having a bunch of economists to inform on a whole range of issues. And that's created that name, and the rest, is, they say, is history.
Right. So you have this, you've built out this large team of economists at the National Center for Environmental Economics. Let's say the Air Office comes up with a new regulatory proposal. Before it's sent over to OMB and enters into some kind of interagency review, That's where, when I was in government, that's when I would sort of get pulled in. Although sometimes we'd hear from the agency before they'd send it over to OMB. Um, what were the kinds of things where they were like looking for you for assistance? Where were there times where they were like, thanks, but no thanks? Help us sort of, give us a little bit of a look underneath the hood, if you will,
Yeah.
about sort of how that process works. Because sometimes, from my experience, being pulled in a little bit later, you see where it works really well, and then other times you can see where there's
Yeah.
tensions.
Yeah. It still is. So a lot of people thought of us as a mini OMB, right? Because the program office, the air office, they would do all their analysis, make their proposal, put it together, and then would send it to the policy office for review. And we would proceed to tell the poor economists, in the air office who spent the last 3 years of their life working up to this benefit, they did it all wrong. Right? It was just a horrible, horrible dynamic. So that had to change, but it took us a long time to figure out that had to change. In fact, in the early days, we used to get credit for making in front of Lee Thomas, who succeeded Bill Ruckelshaus. I still remember I once said, "Yeah, you get credit if you make the program office look bad in front of Lee Thomas, and then when they're laying on the floor, if you kick them a few times, you get even more credit." And so that dynamic I'm happy to say, doesn't exist anymore. It's a much more cooperative model. They kind of get that we NCE we were up to like 53 economists in the early Obama years. That was our apex, but we have these in. It's also true, I think, that economists like working alongside other economists for all kinds of reasons. And so the program offices can't quite compete with us in terms of recruiting because of they're going to be sitting alongside atmospheric chemists, engineers, et cetera, which is fun, but it's as a full-time proposition. And so the economists, we started building ties really with the economists in the program office. It's not perfect, and there's still a lot of offices that cherish their independence and don't really want to engage with us. But on the other hand, there's a lot that do. So things have changed dramatically for the good on that regard. And so we're no longer the OIRA, but we do try then to bring in the latest research and the latest methods and try to help the program offices think about how they could apply this new research to whatever they're doing. So EJ, environmental justice, which was a big priority both in the Obama years and the Biden years, that was new to a lot of economists. And so to ask them to drop everything and figure out how to do environmental justice, and it's not, most people thought, oh, that's just distributional analysis. No, it's not. It's very, it involves a lot of institutional issues and things that you have to go back and learn. And I'm sure you guys get exposed to a lot more. But so I think we also wrote the EJ technical guidelines. So it really did, I think, help a lot with the programs trying to catch up in a short amount of time to to give information that the decision makers needed.
So, in building up the National Center for Environmental Economics, recruiting this large team of PhD economists, one of the key elements here is ensuring the sort of scientific integrity of the work you're doing. Part of that is, as you've already noted, you're going to be working with scientists from other disciplines as you tackle, just by the very interdisciplinary nature of these problems, you're going to be tackling them together. Some of it involves, as we made reference to, in the context of the guidelines for economic analysis, working with an external review committee through the Science Advisory Board. Help describe for us sort of what you did in leading NCE and engaging academics on the outside to demonstrate both the importance of the scientific integrity and why you're meeting that bar, both internally in your work for EPA, but then also as that work then became consumed by the public.
The SAB, the Science Advisory Board, was instrumental, and I know Rob's occupied because I talked to him earlier today, but that committee really was landmark because they met a great deal over our guidelines. They gave us a lot of good. No one chairs a meeting like Rob, by the way. I have to say, he was the model of efficiency and hit every key point. But the letter that he transcribed back to the administrator was so important because they talked about economics as a science. And over time we were able to get, like, I sat on something called the Science Technology Policy Council, which is the highest career scientists in the agency sit around on a council to sort of police scientific integrity in the agency. For the record, that hasn't met in a while, but it was very active. And both Republican and Democratic administrations over my career. So to get economics with social sciences in the same plateau, in place as toxicology and epidemiology and fate and transport modeling, et cetera, was, I think, key. And that SAB review of our guidelines and the fact that it was the purview of all these top economics. And frankly, we had the best of environmental economists in the country. And notwithstanding, I don't think the toxicology and the epidemiology, they could not match us in terms of the reputation and the power that we were bringing to the table to help advise EPA. So that helped a lot. And then I'd still remember too, when Carol was talking about this reorganization and moving all the climate stuff to, and she did throw up, maybe we should move all the economists to ORD. And it was this SAB that said, no, 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 don't do that. The economists need to be close to the policy action. They need to help inform policy. And
ORD being the Office of Research.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
Yes. So again, that office was recently eliminated, but one of the largest offices in EPA was the Office of Research and Development. They funded. They both had an extramural grants program and a lot of in-house research as well on a wide range of issues, and I don't know, 8 or 9 labs across the country. So it was a big operation. But I think had we moved there at the time, there was a bit appealing to me, frankly, because it's a research calling. Is oftentimes economists think that's the highest calling, and but they were right. So Rob was right, and so that advice, I think, also made a big difference at the time. So it did kind of smash the sort of science colliding with policy for the first time. I think up until that time, even after, I think a lot of administrators thought they could make the decision without any of this information, that they knew what the right decision was. Frankly, that happens a lot with administrators when they first get there, and then they realize how complicated stuff is. And so a lot of our biggest victories are when we talk an administrator out of what she wants to do. So, and you do that with some carefulness, because you don't want to say that they don't know what they're doing, but so you have to walk through like cooling water intakes on power plants. I don't know. So like your car radiator has a closed cooling water system, right? The idea in the Clean Water Act is to do that same thing for power plants, both as large as nuclear power plants all the way down to small plants. And Lisa Jackson at the time thought, I definitely think this is the right solution, right? Because after all, you take water that's from these cool streams and lakes and stuff, and you return it, and it's a lot hotter, it's going to kill all the fish, and right, and also you're sucking in a lot of water, so you're sucking in a lot of fish and eggs and stuff, and so it's just not good for the ecology. So the idea of this closed system made a lot of sense. But if you ever see these round cooling water towers, that's the byproduct of it. And so it turned out that there's a parasitic load, that these cooling water towers don't cool them the same as freshwater would. And so it's a 4 to 5% hit on your efficiency of a power plant that would have to be made up somewhere. So we had these carbon emissions coming off somewhere else to make up for that load. There's also a lot of PM that comes off of these cooling water towers, a lot. And so
fine particulate matter.
Yeah. Yep. So until you do all that analysis, you don't know, right? You just intuitively, it was very appealing, but of course the water office, because they're concerned about water quality, and that includes temperature, they were emphasizing the temperature part of it. And so it definitely, these things made sense in a lot of places, but they didn't make sense on the Detroit River, which is, at the time was a dead river. So anyway, that's where I think analysis can shed a lot of light. There's tons of examples, but that's one that comes to mind.
So mentioning fine particulate matter, starting in the mid 1990s, we're starting to learn from some epidemiological research, some of it conducted by our colleagues over at the School of Public Health here at Harvard, about the impacts, the really serious adverse impacts fine PM has on premature mortality. This starts to show up both in regulatory analyses and in the retrospective benefit cost analysis of the Clean Air Act over 1970 to 1990. How does, when you, and that's again where you're going to be working with the Air Office on some of this. I think the retrospective analysis is actually issued by the Air Office. But a lot of the work that eventually was reflected, I think, in the 2000, that very first edition of the economic guidelines, you're sort of building up the sort of standards and the procedures that are becoming more and more regularized within the agency in the late 1990s. When you do this, then though for fine PM, and we start to see really, really big benefits, like the retrospective analysis saying there's $22 trillion of benefits versus $500 billion of cost. Uh, how does that start to influence then how the economics informs the politics? And also, how does that start to influence the kinds of questions you're getting from the administrator?
Also a great question. So for the record, we were co-partners with the Air Office on the retrospective.
Yeah,
I myself was teamed up with a guy named Jim DeMarker from the Air Office.
right, right.
We had a lot of fun, and a bunch of economists. By law, the law that required that report also required an advisory group, and Dick Schmollensee and Bill Lordhouse, a whole bunch of top names. Again, on the economist side, were quick to volunteer. We've never been wanting from support from the academic community. But so we proceeded to do that. And because we had this advisory committee that was so strong, and um, I think the results sort of stood up well, even though they're almost unbelievable. So there was a guy affiliated with American Enterprise Institute who had this big workshop, and he invited Maureen Cropper, who was on the advisory committee, to speak on behalf. And I forget who the other, I think Paul Portney spoke, but anyway, Maureen stood up and said, because she also thought the numbers were too big to even believe, but she said, if I have to choose between Randy's number, who's the guy that AI who redid them, or EPA's, I choose EPA's. And she just ticked off all the reasons why the EPA numbers were so much more credible. And so even within this sort of bastion of conservative thinking at AEI, that number prevailed, or those numbers prevailed. And Lester Lave, I don't know if you guys ever heard of him, but uh, he's a giant in the early field of environmental economics. He passed away a bit ago, but he was also on a later advisory committee. And he even said he thought it was this landmark study that convinced people that we had to embark then on our sort of regulatory agenda to get these massive benefits, right? I mean, you could argue, and I think Joe would, that the VSL is as applied could be better applied, and
The value of
maybe better
statistical
tailored.
life.
Yeah,
How we monetize those
right,
reductions in premature
right.
mortality.
Because the premature mortality is both primarily of the very young, but mostly of the people over 70, 75. So there is an issue there, I think. But nonetheless, even if we'd made those corrections, the benefits would still be massive. And so, and we're learning all the time that PM is just really uh, has all kinds of cognitive implications of what, how well we do in school, how well we think, degenerative brain disease, et cetera. There's all kinds of things that we're learning about PM, but that did, both in the Bush administration, Clinton administration, and beyond, that I think supported a regulatory agenda, which, if you ever want to get bored, read the EPA regulatory agenda. It gives you a short look into the future. That regulatory agenda changed fairly dramatically, which is sort of a revealed preference of the effects that study had, because I think people thought this was we were going after air toxics a lot at the time, and those are, while they're clearly relevant for environmental justice, they're, from a benefit cost perspective, they're just not the driver of things like even ozone, but PM in particular would be.
So I'd like to fast forward a little bit to 2009. It is a year after a federal court has told a different agency, the Department of Transportation, that it doesn't know what the social cost of carbon is, but it's not zero. And we now have in the Obama administration an interagency working group stood up to try to produce a common social cost of carbon across the federal government. They used three major models. Who actually ran those models?
This is another. That's good. I'm glad you asked that, Joe. So we did have an A team in the Biden administration, ideally suited to think about climate and how to value the emissions, both from a benefits perspective for reductions or costs and in terms of an increase. So They did form this interagency working group, Cass Sunstein, uh, at Harvard Law School, but also Michael Greenstone was there, and Billy Pizer was over at Treasury, and Richard Newell was running EIA, who's the former president of RFF. But anyway, it definitely was an A team. But when push comes to shove, they invited NCE in, right? Or each agency got to send like 2 people uh, into this working group, but no more than 2. That was like the cap. And there were blood was let at EPA about who would get to go, to be honest. So the Air Office thought they should get to go. Um, but anyway, I did prevail to be one of the reps, and halfway through the thing, I would say when the work was finally figured out who was going to do what, I had like 6 or 7 people in the room, and it was all NCE economists that were running the 3 major integrated assessment models and doing all the number crunching and doing the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of runs to get at a more robust treatment of uncertainty in a Monte Carlo sense. And even got compliments from Michael Greenstone, which that's a joke, but if you know Michael, it was great, very satisfying. So, but it's probably one of the best parts about being in the policy office at NC. When there's an interagency issue or a White House issue, we typically get called, and not the, not the program office, if it's on discounting or that, circular A4 or OMB's guidance, because it's so cross-cutting, you wouldn't send the air office, you'd send the policy office economist to think about that. And so that, I think, is the most fun thing about, because then you get to engage with, you're 1 step even closer to the president in some regards. And so, in fact, I still am grateful to Joe, because when Lisa Heinzerling was my first boss in the Biden administration, if you Google her,
Obama administration.
Obama, sorry, if you Google her, we're friends to this day. So it's not but I joke that she wrote like the manifesto on why benefit cost analysis is so immoral. So, and she's well known for it. And so I claim credit for converting her. I don't think she would ever endorse benefit cost analysis, but she certainly worked very hard at embracing it for purposes of furthering their agenda and things. Which, and I also, I think, told someone this morning that that's she's the one that gave me the extra FTE, the hiring a capability where we hit our max people under her. So, and even our project, she said, these are like good wine. You put them, you invest in them now, but in a couple of years, you're going to get great stuff. So, again, you can only get away with that. So if you're ever thinking about a career, unless you're passionate about a particular issue, like mobile sources, if you did your dissertation on how to regulate, mobile sources or cars, and of course the Office of Transportation Air Quality, EPA or DOT, would be a great place for you to go. But if you're just a really committed environmental economist, a policy office job gives you the most expansive opportunity and the biggest horizon, the biggest research umbrella to think about things as well, and try to connect the dots across different programs.
So your team was critically involved in actually taking these models, the Bill Nordhaus Dice model, Richard Toll's Fund model, Chris Hope's Page model, calibrating them in a systematic way, as we had, as we were working through the interagency working group process, and what kind of assumptions we're going to make, and so on. So there's that sort of initial set of estimates. They're updated periodically during the Obama administration. Near the end of Obama, we have a National Academies report that says we need to up our game. Yeah. When it comes to a number of the key inputs and how we produce the social cost of carbon. Describe for us a little bit then about the work at your office and how you worked with outside academics on this sort of next generation of scholarship that now underpins the social cost of carbon that EPA issued back in 2023.
Yeah. So firstly, despite Joe and Jim being involved, we ran out of time in the Obama administration. We had a lot of work to do on discounting, which still arguably a lot of work needs to be done on that, uncertainty, and certainly the unquantified benefits and things, and even the issue of domestic versus a global number. So there's quite a bit. And so running out of time, I actually don't remember whose idea it was, but the idea of getting the National Academy to look at our work.
I want to take credit for that one.
There you go.
Yeah.
Gels. So it was a brilliant stroke, because before the administration got finished, we had this NASM, National Academies report that spelled out both near-term and long-term recommendations, and even a recommendation of how often to update it. So it gave sort of legitimacy to the numbers that we had with a imprimatur of the National Academies, but it also gave a blueprint of what to do. And boy, was that fortuitous, because then when the Trump administration came in and disbanded the IWG, et cetera, that NAS report served as a blueprint for what work had to be done, and RFF and Michael's Climate Impacts Lab and other researchers at Berkeley, et cetera, all picked up the baton or the report and said, well, this is all the issues, and here's what we have to do to solve it. And so we didn't lose a beat when the Biden reconvened. We actually, for the first time ever, got to work alongside RFF and Michael's Climate Impacts Lab. We met on a weekly basis. We actually hired them as contractors to make sure it was all legal, but to generate the revised estimates that you probably have heard about or read about. So that was, yeah, it doesn't get any better than
yeah. So, but it's one of those important things. Like if you're going to make sure you've got the cutting edge evidence from the scientific research to inform policy, it's building those relationships and really integrating them into your work to be most effective.
Yeah, I think it takes something with that high profile. So when we're looking at PFAS, there's some really good work going on now with PFAS risk assessment, which economists then taken, but it's still a chain, right? First, the epidemiologists and toxicologists have to come up with their stuff, and then we don't like it, and we say, well, this doesn't really help us do benefits analysis, and what about all these other things? And then again, they like paradigms of certainty. So unless you have overwhelming evidence, they don't like to quantify anything. But as economists, if there's willingness to pay, even despite of uncertainty, that's still a benefit, right? And so there's like a communications barrier as well as a timing issue. And so that's a lot to overcome. The social cost of carbon work that was all solved. And even though it wasn't all economists, there's definitely a lot of people running these climate models and things, which are, but it all just sort of came together. And I think it was partly the success that we enjoyed in the Obama administration with the first round and understanding the importance of it. I think it was coined as the most important number you never heard of, but I think that, all of us in this room have heard of it. So that would be the model to follow. And I think if we could do that with more high urgency or high important environmental problems, that would be fantastic.
Great. Let me ask two more questions before we open it up for the audience. So I want people to be ready with their questions. What do you see as you kind of look back and you say, okay, here are some existing gaps where we could do a better job, or maybe it's something that's an emerging issue, and you're like, hey, here's something that we should tackle moving forward.
That's actually was a great segue from our last point. So my biggest frustration, and I fought a lot with people in OIRA and elsewhere on it, is this idea of uncertainty in benefits calculation. There is a mantra or a way of thinking among public health officials that unless it's replicated 18 times, you cannot quantify it. So I still remember, even when we did the retrospective study, there was some strong evidence, I thought, on infant mortality in PM, SIDS, and but there was like 4 or 5 articles, right? But the public health people on our advisory group, oh no, that's not enough evidence to quantify anything. You can't do that. And so, and that's true now for chemicals. So on cancer, you probably all know that the science community rates the evidence as either causal, likely causal, suggestive. There's all these descriptors that sort of look at the weight of evidence. EPA for the longest time had this policy that unless it's causal, we don't quantify it. And so if they don't quantify the risk, we can't quantify the benefits, right, of getting rid of that risk, of that exposure. So it's extremely frustrating to me. Like if your neighborhood restaurant, if 3 people all got food poisoning in your neighborhood and they happen to eat there, well, I don't know we can't absolutely say that's causal, but I sure as hell wouldn't eat there. And so,
Al, you're a Bayesian, you're updating.
So, but in general, it's we faced this on first when it came to me was on formaldehyde. There's like a lot of evidence, a different dose response, that nasal tumors and things on formaldehyde, and I tried to rule this out in an RIA, and because Congress wrote this law that actually dictated what EPA had to do in terms of an option, we had to adopt the California standard. This is formaldehyde in presswood products like particle board and plywood. I thought, okay, this will be like a receptive audience because it's the decision is not riding on this analysis. So we had all these benefits quantified using the best available stuff, and um, yeah, there was a big red line strikeout. Lisa Heinzling, my former boss, actually wrote an editorial, I think, in the Wall Street Journal. It called it a red line strikeout bloodbath because it was all red. Um, so there's still, I think, a bias against things that are just they could be very frank, very serious effects, but they're just not enough evidence. But at what point do you and how you consider them in a regulatory analysis, I think is a major issue. And things like PFAS and a lot of this stuff gets out there, I think, because we're not willing to quantify these things, which is partly why I like benefit cost analysis, because it's a model for transparency as well. If you want to count that benefit, let's put it in there. Let's think about ways maybe to treat the uncertainty as well, but at least we're being upfront as opposed to saying we're not going to quantify it because it's too uncertain. So that's one big thing, and I think the VSO, which we mentioned, is another. So we haven't updated. EPA hasn't updated its VSL for a long time. So for folks that don't know, we do up the estimate using an income elasticity. And so as the per capita income in the country goes up, we bump up our estimate of the VSL, but preferences change over time dramatically and even within groups. And so we are using literature that's from the 1980s to apply today, which is a bad benefits transfer practice in anyone's practice. So, we definitely need to, but how do you create an environment where the political leadership of an agency is okay with you coming up with a new estimate of life, value of life. So it's always been a hard one to tackle. But and again, it might be something where the SAB or outside groups could play a major role in leading the agency to get the right place on stuff like that as well.
As you noted, I did a little research on this, some of it when I was a doctoral student. And at one point, my mom asked me about how my research was going. And I said, well, I'm doing work on the value of life. She kind of paused and looked at me. And she's like, I thought you were in an economics program. So the final question. You worked under a lot of administrators in both Democratic and Republican administrations. Who was your favorite?
The person I'm in awe of is Bill Ruckelshaus for what he did. And I only came in the waning months of him. And he, of course, did resign because of policy differences with the White House as well. So, and I respect that. But my favorite is actually someone else who resigned, I think, because of policy differences. And that was Governor Whitman, former governor of New Jersey. As you know, President Bush campaigned with a 4 pollutant bill. One was carbon. And I still think that proposal had a lot of merit, right? So it's like sweep away all these command and control things and think about cap and trades for the things that we really matter about. And but there were some folks, I think, that sort of prevented her from pursuing that 4 pollutant bill. And so I don't know what's in her head, but I know that when we briefed her, she asked all the right questions. She wanted to know what the risks are, what the benefits were. She even on arsenic and drinking water, she took a lot of heat. But we, as an agency of economists and analysts, we did not have all the answers that she needed to make the decision she thought, so she tried to buy more time. So I think she came closest to the model that an economist would appreciate, that she wanted to weigh everything. And even in the arsenic case, when we came up with this cost estimate and the risks were pretty high for some communities, she went out and found money for these, particularly in the West, these small communities whose median income is like below $25,000 at the time. And the cost per household for this stuff was $350 to $500 per year. That gets passed on in water bills, which I told her I wouldn't pay that, so I think she came closest to the ideal for me for a careful and considered effect without coming in with biases, although, et cetera. So there are other good ones. Bill Rowley had some great lines. So when he this was Bush one. He was the administrator, and he stuck it out. And some of the more conservative elements of the administration really took it out on him. He went to Rio first, the early
The Earth Summit,
as a cop and stuff, and pushed that. But when the president pushed a moratorium on regulation, because the Wall Street Journal ended up doing some story on how this administration is just as regulatory as Clinton was, or something to that effect. Bush imposed a moratorium, a 90-day moratorium on all regulation. And I'm meeting with Bill Rowley and like, what are we going to do with this? It's not going to go. And he goes, well, because we were in a recession. He goes, a recession is really a wringing out, right, of inefficiencies. You get businesses that aren't really doing well. Why can't we wring out the really bad regulations at EPA? So I don't know. To this day, I thought that was like a brilliant way to think about it. And it actually then pushed me and others to think about what are the really dogs of regulations that we really do need to revisit. And we came up with some good ones. So that was, so every administrator I think has some strengths, but yeah, those are, I think Governor Whitman still ranks up there, I think, for me.
Okay.
I had a rule in my office, you couldn't say anything bad about her. So few edicts, but.
So let me open it up for questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you for your time. Brian, first year MPP student here. And in line with the most recent question, what is different and what is the same as far as EPA leadership in this current administration?
So, good question, and an obvious one. I think in some ways, obviously, if you read the newspapers and things. So I left at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is October 1. So I don't have full intel on stuff. And every time an administration comes in, they take at least 6 months to get their act together, right? And I think it's less in the White House because they come landed, and most of the EPA leadership is confirmed by the Senate. So the number one and number two, but also the heads of the air office, water office, et cetera. And they come in varying paths. So until you really know who you're working with, it's hard to judge. And it tends to be, EPA can be stovepipe, so that the air office lead, if you just work on air, that's going to be your view of the agency. If you just work on water or just drinking water or Superfund, then you're going to have a different view. So it really does matter. I don't want to not dancing around. I'll get to your question, but it does matter what program you're working in. So even Pruitt, who was Mr. Pruitt was Trump's first guy. He loved Superfund. You couldn't get, he wanted to double the program. I don't know, I'm not sure why or what motivated that, but he really, if you worked in Superfund, you felt fully supported by him. So, so I would say though that the differences are, based on what I know now, that the OMB memo that really says we're no longer going to use the social cost of carbon or even quantify it, and perhaps the backing off of co-benefits and other things, which are, I thought, settled science and economics. So, I don't want to say scientific integrity per se, but how one views the science and how that folds into the policymaking apparatus is, I think, dramatically changing as we speak, compared over the last, say, 25 years.
But having established a standard of this is what rigorous evidence means on the economics of some of these issues, and if you see it's a meaningful deviation now, this is getting beyond the scope of your training, but does that create legal risk for them because you've already established this standard practice and that is underlying the analysis and the rules?
I think so. I think there's certainly a lot of lawyers that say yes, it will. So because it's, the laws generally require a well-reasoned decision, and if you're not looking at stuff, is that well-reasoned? It becomes, as the court said, my current boss Ricky Revesz at NYU Law School say, yeah, the courts have a name for that. It's 3 words: arbitrary and capricious. So one could argue that if you're not going to look at this stuff, yeah, you're entering that ground of what's arbitrary and capricious. So I think it's case specific, but some laws, Safe Drinking Water Act, for example, require you to look at all these things, explicitly in the law. So that would really be a slippery slope. And it's, we haven't gotten really to much experience with this new administration on drinking water, so I don't know where they're going with that. But the social cost of carbon thing was certainly not, the first term, they opted to say that only the domestic impacts of climate within the U.S. borders were relevant, and so we did develop an estimate for that number, for just domestic. This second term, they're doing something very different, which is to say we're not going to quantify it at all. So I'll footnote this, that the Science Advisory Board in the first Trump term looked at a revision, a smaller revision than the thing Joe went to our guidelines, and they made a point of saying that the co-benefits needed to be quantified and included in every benefit analysis, and that needed to be even clearer in the guidelines. So even the SAB in the first term seems to be running counter to where they're headed now, at least on some instances. We'll gather more data. Hopefully that won't be, we'll see how that goes, but because of legal and other reasons, maybe there'll be more.
Great.
Thank you. I'm Chang Gui Dong. I'm a visiting scholar at HKS. So you briefly mentioned there are two social cost of carbon, domestic one and a global one. My question is, which one do you think countries should and will be using?
So the should is always a dangerous word for a career economist. So there's sort of normative versus positive, but I of course have opinions. So I don't think there's much debate about the global nature of this externality, and there's various arguments you could throw out there. One is this reciprocity argument, right? If we don't act, then other countries won't act, but if we do, then they will as well. And Matt Cochin and others, I actually think that that's a kind of, I don't know that that should be in the social cost of carbon because it's really not a damage. I actually think it's a numerator issue as well, though, but it's another benefit that we would get, but it's really not a social cost of carbon. But nonetheless, there was a memo that was written a while ago about who has standing in your benefit cost analysis. And so I worked on asbestos, for example, which was the courts overturned. But one of the issues in asbestos is that a lot of it was mined in Canada. And they had a bit of market power, so they had some economic rents going to them. And we counted that in the benefit cost analysis. And the courts threw it out and said that they're not they don't have standing here. Likewise, in ALAR, the example, one of the first things I've been, if you got, ALAR was a plant regulator, so it helped apples store better. And so we predicted with our, that we would actually import more apples during the winter from, and spring from Chile, from, opposite, their winter was when we were having our summer, et cetera. And that made more sense. And we estimated all that. And my boss at the time said, who pays your paycheck? Who pays your salary? And so it wasn't the Chileans. So I'm all that to say is I still think it should be a global number, but that's because I do believe in the world has to sort of solve these problems together, and they are affected by it, and we're affected by them. So there is a reciprocity notion, but it's more of a we need to recognize that this is a global, that our actions are having implications for others, and I don't know how to do that otherwise. So as a footnote to this one, Kath and Joe, and I think when we were working on the very first interagency work group, this was a big debate, and it was decided, I think, by Joe and the White House folks, Kath and stuff, that we would just do both. But as a technical matter, just calculating the damages within the U.S. borders is analytically impossible, I would argue. I mean, we all have, well, not all, but many of us have stocks in international corporations. There's defense bases all over the world. There's the environmental refugee issues that occur and the obligations that we would incur under those. I mean, it's a mess, I think. So it makes it analytically more convenient.
Yeah.
So this is great. Thank you so much, Al. as you pointed out, staying on the social cost of carbon theme, so as you pointed out, because of the NES study, academics, Climate Impact Lab, Resources for the Future, did a whole bunch of work. A lot of folks were involved with for getting ready for what was going, fully expected to be, if there were a Democratic administration, a revamping of the social cost of carbon. You were ready to hit the ground running. First week, EO said, get to work, come
Yep.
back in a year. Why did it take you almost 3 years? And the interesting question under that is, what were the real debates or challenges, or what were the hard analytical issues that you had to resolve?
That's a great question. So it did take us a long time. I think it was a mistake. They actually decided to roll over the old estimates first to get up and running. And I thought we could have made some important changes even to that we've learned a lot, like on discounting and other things, right? And so there were some quick things that I would have done if I were in charge. I wasn't, but nonetheless, then we did form this group. And so we had some new actors in it that were familiar with what the social cost of carbon was, but understandably, they wanted to have their own imprint on it as well, or their own views. And so, like on discounting, we went back and forth on all kinds of issues with discounting, knowing that it would probably have implications for A4 and other things and Ramsey. And then, equity weighting, where some forms of that took forever. So there was one proposal that received a lot of interest, not by EPA, but by other agencies, to value everyone's lives in the entire world the same, as a matter of just equity and like a social welfare preference thing. I thought that would be a disaster. I even pleaded, I said, who's going to testify that the United States government values a North Korean life the same as they value a United States citizen's life? It just seemed like a communications nightmare, but also from a willingness to pay, you're no longer thinking about a Hicks-Kaldor kind of, are the gainers willing to compensate the losers? So we're losing that whole paradigm. And then what does that say about the rest of these benefits that we did apply that benefit to? So it was very messy, I would have to say. But the actual model running and, working with RFF and climate impacts was not messy at all. They were, I will say, particularly the climate impacts, I like the RFF give model with Berkeley, because it was, modular, very transparent. Even I could get in and understand the code behind it, right? The climate impacts built this enormous modeling infrastructure, which was second to none, but it really meant we had to rely on them to do all the modeling as well, which was, but yeah, I think that the lesson there, not that we don't want new actors and new ideas and things, but it helps when you have like Cass and Joe and the other people I mentioned in the first round who are sort of fully committed and understand what where we're going with benefit cost analysis, as opposed to the value of life issue actually went to a fairly high level meeting with like Janet Yellen and a bunch of others in the room. So it was the idea that we would spend that kind of human capital in the administration on that was kind of interesting at some level. So, but
the first time around, I said we're not going to principles. This
No.
is a technical thing.
Yeah.
We don't go to principles.
Yeah.
And I believe that was
Yes.
justified when I did have to brief principles. Near the end of the process, it was right before we issued the report in early 2010. Carol Browner asked me to brief the Green Cabinet, which was sort of the subset of the cabinet, and a few sub-cabinet individuals, leaders in the Obama administration, who had an interest on energy, environment, and resource questions. And Carol said, you have 2 minutes, and your job is just to say, those of you who do regulations that affect greenhouse gas emissions, you're about to have a new way of measuring the benefits. And in fact, I think she may have said those exact words and said, that's all you need to say. You don't even need 2 minutes. But just say a little bit about how they all had great people working on this interagency. I was like, okay, fine. So I start doing that. And then one member of the cabinet, I'm not going to name the Secretary of Energy right now, but he had his laptop open and he had Nick Stern's paper in the Journal of Economic Literature, and he starts asking me questions about the choice of the discount rate. And Carol's giving me a look like, what's going on? And I make a mistake of saying, well, you're not really appropriately taking into account the elasticity, the marginal utility of consumption. And at which point she's just like, what's happening? And I said, Steve, let's just take this offline. We'll talk about it. Discounting is a very important issue. Let's talk offline. And that's when the Secretary of the Interior turned to the Secretary of Agriculture and said, you know, they lost me after the word social cost. And his colleague turned back to him and said, Ken, you're doing better than me. They lost me after the word social. So it's one of these things, which I think you were quoting Michael earlier saying is the most important number no one's ever heard of. It is a very technical issue. It's one that is well grounded, I think, now in both rigorous science and economics. But the idea of saying going to our political leaders, our members of the cabinet, and say, can we resolve this, doesn't seem to be the best use of their time. And if it's anything I learned from my time ago, sometimes you need to say like, no, we shouldn't elevate it. We are the ones who are best positioned to answer this question, and we should do so.
Yeah.
Let me see. We have time for maybe one more question. If there's any others who want to jump in, yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Alita. I'm an MPP1. A quick question. You mentioned the time it takes to do some of these analyses, cost-benefit analyses, and with the limited time of 4 years before there is, presumably a switch in the administration, what is a regulation or kind of an analysis you did for a regulation that you had hoped would go through? You thought was pretty good that ended up being put on a stay or ended up kind of not making it through the next administration?
Probably a lot of those. One footnote is that we are, I think, with NC's leadership, there's a move to, you think about these integrated assessment models are used for climate. They're now being used in water and air as well. So the beauty of that is you don't have to start from scratch every time you're doing a reg, but that's more of an aside. But I worked on several, but we had another one that I thought was a slam dunk was the early formaldehyde and presswood products. I mentioned before, Congress actually passed a law that ordered us to do a standard. But before that, we had TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, which did give us authority to regulate it. We worked on that. I even went to like presswood plants to talk to them about what would they do if we suddenly got rid of formaldehyde resins, and what were the substitutes, how much would they cost? And we worked all that out and we developed all these options. It was a great RIA. It was like to me, a no-brainer as well. And I still to this day, that was 2 years of my life as well. Not the only thing I did, but I still to this day don't know what happened after it got above, my pay grade, but someone killed it. So it definitely happens. Pesticides are another one. I think there's because it's the ag, particularly, I worked on something called allichlor and metallochlor, which is a corn herbicide. And boy, again, that was like a no-brainer to me in terms of at least phasing it out, and that went nowhere. And I think my theory is I have no evidence that there's some checking in with how much angst would this cause, et cetera, and how bad is this stuff really. And so so I think there's certain topics that are more sensitive than others. So I don't know about the presswood products. That was a long time ago, but I was younger then, and that really hurt because I put so much time into it. So it didn't go anywhere.
So Al, a final question for you. We have, as you've already heard, a number of students here. Here at the Harvard Kennedy School, a lot of our students go into public service, whether it's in the federal government or state governments, or some go back to their home countries. We'd love to hear your closing thoughts on the value of a career in public service.
I would still recommend it. So we have one of yours, Elizabeth Spinks, is in NCEE, and she came during the Biden days, thank goodness. So she had enough of a experience then that she's carrying that forward through this administration. But we have not, some of us took that early buyout that was offered, but no one has quit, it wasn't eligible for that buyout and early retirement or whatever. So Elizabeth and all her colleagues are still working hard. And I think they tasted enough of, how good it can be in the good days. And I don't want to say that it's even bad now. They're still doing analysis. They still have to do RIAs, et cetera. And so it's, and there's other, a whole set of colleagues now. I mentioned this more cooperative methods. So the Air Office is, working alongside us and stuff. So it's not, um, I think the policy directions are challenges, right? But it doesn't necessarily affect the workplace itself in terms of what you can accomplish and add perspective. So I still think it would be a great place to land. Of course, it does depend on your interest. If you're the one that wants to shut your door all day, well, I used to have some of them, right? There was a few that would shut their door and want to just work all day. And you have to figure out ways to use that. And so we built a computable general equilibrium model for use in policy analysis, and that does take someone who wants to sit and write code all day. But then there's others who can't wait to engage with the program officers about, we use a model called IPM, integrated planning model, for the power sector. And when we get results of that from different policy options, there's nothing more exciting and fun to think through. What is this model telling us? How do we translate it for decision makers? Is this a good idea, and what's driving this and stuff? And that's something we all get together. I mean, it's a great, if you like thinking about economics and the mental exercises that puts you through, and you're realizing in the back of your head that this could have policy implications, and as we think through how to design things, that's a great way to spend your day. So.
Great. Before we wrap up, let me know we'll meet again at noon next Monday. We'll be hosting Andrea Yadsampa. Andrea will be talking about how to make progress on climate change in our polarized political environment. Finally, please join me in thanking Alma Gartland, both for his insights today and for his service. Thank you so much, Al.
Great job. Great job, Dan.